Dawn and the Darkest Hour by George Woodcock. A look at the life of Aldous Huxley. 1. Introduction. To have read Aldous Huxley years ago in his prime as a novelist was to become aware immediately of a mind divided and searching. And at no time did this aspect of Huxley's writing become more evident than when his search led him in a direction unfamiliar and even repugnant to those who had admired him in his personification of the critical spirit in the decades between the great wars. I remember when Eyeless in Gaza was published, reading it with bewilderment and a sense of betrayal. I was 24, emerging from that provincial innocence which the long sleep of rural England still preserved into my adolescent years in the 20s. Huxley's early novels, from Chrome Yellow to Point Counterpoint, had accelerated the mental liberation which began for me with the belated reading of Wells and Shaw. He seemed to represent the kind of freedom which might be termed freedom from, said Stephen Spender, of one's youthful impressions of Huxley, freedom from all sorts of things such as conventional orthodoxies, officious humbug, sexual taboos, respect for establishments. I had felt also, without completely understanding it, the characteristic ambivalence of novels like Chrome Yellow and Antic Hay, the sense of delicious treason in the knowledge that Huxley was fascinated as well as repelled by the life of a meretricious intellectuality, and futile, moneyed gaiety, which he portrayed so sardonically, and yet at times so seductively. I was dazzled. How could one be less? To encounter the mind of one of the great polymaths of our age as it played over an encyclopedic variety of subjects. I was stirred to endless speculation by the discussions and pontifications on novel, daring themes with which Huxley's characters perpetually bored and entertained each other, and which spilled over into the brilliant essays in collections like Proper Studies and Do What You Will. I doubt if I have since read any writer who has offered much manifold stimulation as one found in Huxley when one began to read him at the age of 18. Even Brave New World, on its appearance in 1932, I admired mainly for its intellectual agility, as a brilliant feat of futurist fantasy, combined perhaps with a little cautionary fun at the scientific world, with which Huxley had such close links through his grandfather and his brother Julian. I gave as little thought as most other readers then to the seriousness of its criticism of the scientific method, or, for that matter, to the prospect, which became alarmingly evident only 10 years later in the 1940s, that what one read as a fantasy might actually be a prophecy, and that if politicians and scientists did not combine for more positive ends than had moved them up to the present, an intellectual and spiritual wilderness of the kind Huxley portrayed might be not 6 centuries away, but in the immediate future. My attitude to Huxley was complicated by the fact that in my own way, as a librarian pacifist, I accepted the political militancy of the 30s. I applauded Huxley's abandonment in 1935 of his political antagonism and his willingness to advocate not only militant resistance to war, but also a policy of general social reorganization aimed at replacing the institution of the state, with its built-in tendency to coercion and bellicosity, by a libertarian society in which, as he later said in prefacing the 1946 edition of Brave New World, economics would be decentralist and Henry Georgian, politics, Kropotkinesque, and cooperative. When war came, I even took part at some temperamental cost in experimental communities of pacifists, which followed the same lines as the cooperative community planned by Mr. Proctor in Huxley's War Eve novel. After many a summer, in these communities, we aim to oppose the negation of the war by building the nuclei of an alternative society in what we called, using a phrase invented by Huxley's quondam friend John Middleton Murray, the interstices of the totalitarian order. We failed, but the point I would make is that at the end of the 30s, despite the rival attractions of fashionable Marxism, a great many young people regarded Huxley not only as one of the finest novelists of the time, but also as a prophet who in many ways spoke on their behalf. He expressed with admirable skill and disillusionment with war and with the society that produced in which characterized the 20s and ripened through the Depression. Up to Brave New World, his novels seemed inspired by that liberal skepticism which survived as a heritage from the Enlightenment and from the great evolutionary controversy in which, by descent from Darwin's great champion, he was peculiarly related. At the same time, his belated conversion to active war resistance seemed to place him within the parallel tradition of radical political dissent that stemmed in England from Godwin, the Chartist, and the largely pacifist British socialist movement. Then, in the summer of 1936, on the eve of the Spanish Civil War, Aldous in Gaza was published. The man who had seemed the most gleamingly rational of all the writers to emerge into prominence during the 1920s, only compare the intellectual clarity of any of his earlier novels with the manifold obscurities of Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and even D.H. Lawrence, had written a novel describing a conversion to mystical religion. He had also suggested, with obvious didactic intent, that such a spiritual evolution was not merely compatible with the pacifist and decentralist politics which he had recently been preaching in print and on public platforms, but was perhaps the only condition under which they could become effective. In the atmosphere of the later 30s, as the Spanish War heightened in intensity and became the focus of a passionate mental agony among European intellectuals, the radical young became what Huxley later called nothing but men. Whether we termed ourselves communist, socialist, anarchist, or militant pacifist, we not only believed in the ultimate power of scientific progress to lead us to utopia, we also saw no problem that the reasonable application of social planning could not solve. Perhaps we did not hold with Rousseau that man was naturally good, but we did hold that he was naturally social. Where he gave the appearance of being antisocial, we believed the fault lay not in him but in the perverting effect of artificial and coercive institutions, puritanical rules of behavior, and unjust economic systems. Remove the institutions, clean up the economics, expel the Puritans, then the naturally cooperative qualities of man could produce a society that would work without coercion, and merely from its inherent tendency to mutual aid. We did not pause to consider how it was that man, if he were so naturally inclined to live peacefully and helpfully with his fellows, had contrived to build up such a remarkable variety of social and political institutions based on power, domination, and violence, and had so rarely, in the great sweep of history, achieved a society that operated by mutual aid alone. We were not, I realize in looking back, very different in our attitudes from the radical youth of today. It was because of this naive confidence in human reason and idealism that swept over us in the 30s, in spite of the hysterical evil that was transforming Germany, in spite of the corruption of the Russian Revolution displayed by the Moscow trials, that we were disturbed and disappointed at what seemed a retreat into obscurantism on the part of one of the writers we most admired. It seemed another case of the lost leader, but Huxley was too independent ever to have posed as a leader, and too speculative ever to become a lost leader, as we might have recognized if he had interpreted correctly the ambivalence of his early novels. His great virtue, the kind of virtue that did not shine brightly in such a period, was the combination of honesty and courage with which he moved from stage to stage in a highly personal intellectual progress. He never feared to reverse an opinion to appear in opposition to his own past. He had that willingness to accept the appearance of self-contradiction, which has always been the mark of an independent and creative thinker. Long before the fate of the Republican Spain had led quasi-communist writers like W. H. Auden and Stephen Spender to agonizing reprisals of their philosophical positions. Huxley had recognized that there is more to the human condition than bread alone, or bread in political freedom, or even bread in art. The cult of the body he had always mistrusted. There are few modern books so permeated with a sense of the vulnerability and corruptibility of the flesh as Huxley's novels. The cult of the mind he had begun to mistrust, largely because his own mental agility made every intellectual trick seem so easy. By the time he became friendly with D.H. Lawrence in 1926, for a few years, Lawrence's influence drew him to a kind of vitalist limbo, where, still declaring his faith in reason, he sketched out in Do What You Will, and in the speeches of the Lawrencian Rampion of Point Counterpoint, a philosophy of balanced living that went as far in constructing a moral system as was possible without a religious foundation. It did not go far enough for Huxley, who reasoned himself eventually into two drastic conclusions. First, he abandoned the cherished tradition of the Huxley clan by recognizing that the process of abstraction implicit in the scientific method actually diverted men from perceiving the realities of existence. This he derived largely from Lawrence. He also reached, as independently as a man of omnivorous reading ever reaches, a mental goal, the conclusion that man's miseries were due to the lack of a spiritual dimension to his existence. In reasoning thus, Huxley did not feel that he was escaping into the mental isolation of which others accused him. Far from it. He saw himself joining the great invisible church of men and women from all races, religions, and times, who had embraced what he termed the perennial philosophy. Often during his later life he was to expound that philosophy. Its essential doctrines were stated with the succinctness of maxims. In the introduction he wrote in 1947 to a translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood, another detector from the political orthodoxies of the 30s. First, the phenomenal world of matter and of individualized consciousness, the world of things and animals and men and even gods, is the manifestation of a divine ground, within which all partial realities have their being and apart from which they would be non-existence. Second, human beings are capable not merely of knowing about the divine ground by inference, they can also realize its existence by a direct intuition, superior to discursive reasoning. The immediate knowledge unites the knower with that which is known. Third, man possesses a double nature, a phenomenal ego and an eternal self, which is the inner man, the spirit, the spark of divinity within the soul. It is possible for a man, if he so desires, to identify himself with the spirit and therefore with the divine ground, which is of the same or like nature with the spirit. Fourth, man's life on earth has only one end and purpose, to identify himself with his eternal self, and so to come to unitive knowledge of the divine ground. In hindsight, away from the literary ambience and the political passions of the 30s, one can follow more clearly the path that brought Huxley to this destination. His exploration of the apparent meaninglessness of man's fate and his universe had been as thorough as that of any French absurdists. From the early brightness of chrome yellow, which had struck one as a jeu d'esprit, as gratuitous as the importance of being earnest, his vision darkened, with only a faint light gleaming from Calamy's private Thebaid in Those Barren Leaves, point counterpoint. The terminal novel of this first period projected a sardonic pessimism, which made John Atkins describe it justly as Huxley's descent into hell. It was indeed a parallel to the classic journey into the underworld that in heroic myths precedes victory and in religious myths precedes enlightenment. It was in many ways a novel of no return. As Huxley surveyed the impasse into which even Lawrencean vitalism had led him, he must have seen three possible paths before him. He could lapse into silence, but he was by nature, vocation, and habit a writer, and as he said long afterwards to Atkins, he did not think that writing is in any way incompatible with understanding. He could continue with diminishing vigor to repeat himself as a chronicler of futility. There is always a market for cynicism. But Huxley never wrote merely for the sake of writing or the sake of fame. And even when, without false shame, he worked for money, he wrote only of what interested him. He had to go where his thoughts led him, and at the beginning of the 30s, they led him along a path quite different from any he had followed before. The change in direction was marked, though none at the time read the sign correctly, by the appearance of Brave New World. Brave New World, expressing the neo-Lawrencean rejection of science as the basis of moral values, stood on the borderline between the Peacockian novels, which examined the negations of the educated and moneyed strata of contemporary Western society, for Huxley knew and wrote little of the submerged nine-tenths of this world, and the later novels in which the materialistic existence typical of our times was always balanced by the search for positive moral existence. The latter tendency may not be immediately evident in Brave New World itself, for the society which the novel portrays has abandoned even the inadequate spiritual and intellectual goals of the 20th century for a mess of synthetic happiness, while John the Savage from the Indian reservation in New Mexico, who embodies the contrary attitude, presents a strange, ineffectual combination of the better values of the past, screened through the solitary readings of Shakespeare, and the mindless primitivism he has absorbed from an unchanging and artificially preserved Indian tradition. It is the form more than the content of Brave New World that is important in the light of Huxley's later development. The book is a utopia, even if a negative one, and Huxley will return constantly to the genre as a convenient fictional frame for portraying sometimes the search for a positive society and sometimes its diametrical opposite. In positive form, it will be represented by Mr. Proctor and his cooperative commune in After Many a Summer. It will swing back into negation in Ape and Essence, when the realm of Belial is established as a savage anti-utopia among the survivors of nuclear holocaust in post-World War III California. And then, in Island, Huxley's last novel, and almost his final book, all the evils he has been warning against since the late 30s, overpopulation and coercive politics, militarism and mechanization, the destruction of the environment, and the slavish worship of science, will find their opposites in the gentle and doomed utopia of the insular realm of Pala. There is, of course, another way in which Brave New World sets a pattern for Huxley's later novels. It is the first among his imaginative works to be avowedly didactic, to teach a lesson we are invited to follow. In his earlier novels, Huxley had been at great pains to construct works that were artistically pleasing, and he found in his patterns of ideas developed in conversation and of behavior observed in emotional detachment the means of creating, if not novels in the orthodox sense, at least a kind of fiction that had its appealing forms. Point Counterpoint, in particular, was a work of impressive literary artifice, though, as Huxley's forgotten contemporary Humbert Wolff once said, less accurately of Spring, it has all the beauty save the heart. But in Brave New World, the form is less emphatic because it is deliberately less elaborated. Huxley has a lesson he's anxious to teach, and he is willing to sacrifice something of elegance, something of pattern, to make sure that his homily does not go unheard. He is facing, as he will face with growing acuteness, the dilemma of the writer, possessed with religious and moral convictions to which he must give expression, yet aware that in such matters the teacher is always the enemy of the artist. He will solve the question by changing his views on the necessity of artistic perfection. Even before he implicitly changed his views, he had changed his practice, for all the novels that follow Brave New World are homiletic rather than artistic in intent. And if, as I now believe, Eyeless in Gaza is Huxley's best novel, even in purely literary terms, this must be regarded as accidental, for his prime intention was to tell the tale of a conversion in a way that would lead no doubt of its implications in terms of what the Buddhists would call right actions, proceeding from right understanding. Though the novel is written in only obliquely autobiographical terms, the conversion that Eyeless in Gaza portrays is obviously a reflection of Huxley's own, of that extraordinary inversion of his view of existence which took place after the death of Lawrence. Huxley's actual interest in mystical religion was nothing new. As an undergraduate at Balliol 20 years before the writing of Eyeless in Gaza, he had read many Western and Oriental religious texts. Later, he was to use these books as material for constructing the perennial philosophy, but in his youth he had read them with a quizzical eye, mystical experiences, like the amorous habits of the cuttlefish, in which he displayed an equal knowledgeability, where among the oddities of life that provoked his curiosity and satisfied his sense of the grotesque, he read them in order to criticize, to debunk, to mock. But then, years later, by the time he wrote Those Barren Leaves, the way of the mystic began to appear to him in a much more positive light. He was not yet converted, but at least he was willing to accept that some kind of undogmatic religious life might be as good a way of dealing with one's sense of the meaninglessness of existence as, say, the lucky but haphazard insights that emerge from the life of art. In his Uncle Spencer, Huxley even foreshadowed his own achievement in Eyeless in Gaza by half prophesying, "Someday, it may be, the successful novelist will write about man's relation to God." The real conversion came later, and Huxley was obviously still undergoing its agonies while he tried to give them expression in Eyeless in Gaza. He started to write that book in 1932, and there is evidence to suggest that it was originally planned as something very different from the novel that emerged out of 4 years of creative agony of a kind Huxley had never experienced before. He did not finish it until towards the end of 1935, after long interruptions due to mental depressions and disturbances of a kind he had never experienced before. This agony of the early 30s was no merely personal grief. It was rather a spiritual climacteric, not unlike that which accompanied the conversion of Leo Tolstoy, so vividly represented as the dark night of mental and spiritual agony through which Levine in Anna Karenina passed before he came ultimately to a sense of inner peace and certainty. The result was the most complexly constructed and the most psychologically convincing novel Huxley ever wrote. I shall return to a closer consideration of Eyeless in Gaza, but the point I wish to make now is that the novel can be seen as the great divide in Huxley's creative life. Geological divides have two aspects, of course, according to whether one crosses or follows them. Crossing, one rises on one side and descends on the other. And this is the way the literary critic is likely to approach the Huxleyan divide. For his novels grow in complexity and quality, with the special exception of Brave New World, as they proceed from Chrome Yellow to Eyeless in Gaza, and decline just as steadily from that novel through After Many a Summer and Time Must Have a Stop to the splendidly intentioned Bathos of Island. The reason, of course, is that in the later 30s years of his life, Huxley quite deliberately turned from the role of writer as artist to that of writer as teacher. One can even present the change statistically. Among the first 10 books Huxley published between 1916 and 1924, 9 could be classed as imaginative fiction or verse, and only 1 as expository, and that merely a collection of light occasional pieces written while Huxley was assistant director to the Athenaeum. Huxley's last 10 books, appearing between 1948 and 1963, included only 3 examples of imaginative writing, all fiction. The rest were essays of varying lengths, devoted to the social and philosophical questions which Huxley now found so important. Even this count is deceptive, for all the 3 novels Huxley completed in his last period, Ape and Essence, The Genius and the Goddess, and Island, were romans aves didactic to a degree beyond anything he wrote in his earlier period. By this time, in fact, Huxley had abandoned the life of art. He had never been an aesthete. Such a stance would hardly have been compatible with the fiction of ideas to which he always aspired. But as he told 2 inquirers in 1942, he cared as a young man supremely for knowledge for its own sake, for the play of ideas, for the arts of literature, painting, and music, whereas by the time of writing this letter his attitude had changed. He could no longer pursue such things disinterestedly. The letter. For some years now, he continued, I have felt a certain dissatisfaction with these things, have felt that even the great masterpieces were somehow inadequate. Recently I have begun to know something about the reality in relation to which such things as art and general knowledge can be appraised. Inadequate in and for themselves, these activities of the mind can be seen in their true perspective when looked at from the vantage point of mysticism. Those barren leaves of science and of art are barren only when regarded as ultimate ends. Later on, Huxley was not content merely to give art a subsidiary place in his philosophic scheme. Like Tolstoy, he began to question its moral justification. True, he never committed the kind of aberrations of fanaticism into which Tolstoy was led. He never demanded a literature that would lower its standards or debase its language to give moral lessons to hypothetically simple people, though he was always willing to write on his own terms for popular magazines. And his inbred sense of proportion saved him from such a philistinism as Tolstoy displayed in his condemnation of Shakespeare. Instead, in his last essay, completed the week before his death, Shakespeare and Religion, he attempted to place Shakespeare securely within the pattern of the perennial philosophy. Yet, as he grew older, there were times when Huxley had his doubts about even the best works of art. Partly, he felt, they were inadequate instruments in the search for enlightenment. He expressed this thought a few years after his conversion by means of an image which showed no diminution in his He expressed his thought a few years after his conversion by means of an image which showed no dimin, dimin, dimi, oh my, diminution. He expressed his thought a few years after his conversion by means of an image which showed no diminution in his power of artifice. He expressed his thought a few years after his conversion by means of an image which showed no diminution in his power of artifice. The quote of the letter. The more I think of art, he said at the founding of Gerald Heard's Trabuco College in 1942, I realize that, though artists do establish contact with spiritual reality, they establish it unconsciously. Beauty is imprisoned, as it were, within the white spaces between the lines of a poem, between the notes of music, in the apertures between groups of sculpture. This function or talent is unconscious. They throw a net and catch something, though the net is trivial. But one wants to go further. One wants to have a conscious taste of those holes between the strings of the net. More than that, Huxley realized that art flourishes on human misery and folly. If we are to accept the beauty of its flowers, we must accept the corruption from which they spring, and this he was increasingly unwilling to do. He would rather live in some Switzerland of the spirit where artists flourished rarely but wars never came, than inhabit the Frances and Germanys of the intellect with their splendor built on human wretchedness. The logical consequence of such a view was necessarily a literature in which the aesthetic element is always subordinated to the moral message, and this is the case in all of Huxley's books after Aldous and Gaza. Such a reunification would be impossible to imagine in the case of the complete artist like James or Joyce. But Huxley, while to the end he took a pride in the craft of writing, had never considered himself exclusively the artist. The fact that he was as enamored of knowledge for its own sake as of any of the arts suggested already a polygamous relationship with the muses, an insecure loyalty. There were times when he was as much aware as his strictest critics that, as he put it himself, I am not a born novelist, but some other kind of man of letters possessing enough ingenuity to be able to simulate a novelist's behavior, not too convincingly. Perhaps, indeed, he was too harsh to himself in such a judgment, made after he had reached the divide. For whatever kind of fiction writer one may class him, there is no doubt that Aldous in Gaza and his earlier novels in the Peacockian vein are the best English examples of a kind of intellectual moralist fiction more widely practiced on the continent of Europe. Indeed, It is in a continental tradition that of the homme de lettres, his own some kind of man of letters, that he rarely belongs. The writer who is proud first of all of his sheer ability to write, and is willing to apply that ability to any task which seems at the time important, without feeling in any way demeaned of. Instead of a novel or a poem, he happens to write a political tract or a newspaper article, provided always he is saying something that seems worth recording. Given his desire to apprehend the truths that art finds only unconsciously, Huxley would not have shared the idea that once he had reached the divide of his career, the journey was downward. Rejecting the aesthetic criteria that would make inevitable such an admission, he chose to see himself traveling along the ridge, with the chance of climbing more than one peak of insight before he reached the end of his journey. He had not entered these mountains of speculation to become a hermit, like Calamy in those barren leaves. On the contrary, he found the views stupendous and revealing, and because of the greater understanding of the world and its problems which his new path gave him, he felt he could reveal more clearly the dangers that beset mankind through the retention of moral and political errors, and through the destruction of an environment in which man had his proper place and no more. Huxley perceived no real division between his views of the life of the spirit and his ideas of what should be done by sensible beings in the phenomenal world. He saw both as projections of man's dual nature. It seemed to him that the intuition leading to the knowledge of divinity was no less rational than the intelligence that sought to reshape existence so as to reach the limit of human happiness. Certainly, though, a perceptible decline in Huxley's powers as an imaginative writer cannot be denied. There appears little loss to the end of his life in his power of argument and exposition. His remarkable intelligence, differently deployed than in his youth, remained acute as ever, his knowledge as broad, though otherwise channeled his power of fertile generalization even more impressive than in the past. The retreat into a religio-political conservatism resembling that of his friend T.S. Eliot, which was expected by those who were troubled by eyeless in Gaza, did not materialize. Indeed, on many issues, Huxley worked ahead of his time. Long before the civil disobedience movement changed American society in the 1960s, he had accepted the transforming power of nonviolent rebellion. World problems like population growth, the exhaustion of resources, the destruction of the environment, now subjects of urgent public discussion, might have been solved if men had listened to Huxley's warnings 10 years ago. Huxley's, again, correction. World problems like population growth, the exhaustion of resources, the destruction of the environment, now subjects of urgent public discussion, might have been solved if men had listened to Huxley's warnings years ago. The decentralist society which fashionable anarchists like Paul Goodman and perpetual student rebels like Tom Hayden advocated he had already sketched out before the end of the 30s, partly from scientific curiosity and partly from a desire to open any door that might lead to a mystical experience matching his rational understanding of the contemplative path. Huxley was one of the pioneer experimenters with psychedelic drugs, and certainly the first writer of distinction to describe his experiences with them. If the young rebels of today have spiritual ancestors among them, in all but their acceptance of violence, Huxley has a usually unacknowledged place. Distant as his latter Huxley may appear from the young student who in 1916 hoped that the nightmarish interruption of reality produced by World War I might be followed by a race of golden young men and crystal young women, and remoter still from the novelist who in the 20s watched the gold tarnishing and the crystal cracking in a new nightmare of disillusionment, he was in reality the same man. Rebirth is the metaphor we use to describe the process of conversion, but the seed of new birth germinates in the unregenerated past. Conversion is never a break. It is merely a redirection. Many of Tolstoy's critics mistakenly assumed that a great gulf divided and converted Leo from the unconverted Count, but the continuity is unbroken, and the two aspects of the man fit together like the dark and light sides of a face seen in lamplight. Some attitudes were inverted, some modified, few were entirely new. The same applies to Huxley. To understand him completely, we must see his life and work as a unity. In that way, not only do his later teachings acquire the background that places them in perspective, but his earlier works deepen as their half-conscious anticipations open into the future. That unity is the more striking since both parts of Huxley's career can be seen as a movement out of darkness towards light, a movement that begins in the events of his early life. These events not only affected his physical existence, they also became transformed into metaphors that were powerful in shaping the thoughts and directing the spiritual pilgrimage of a lifetime. In the chapters that follow, I shall begin by discussing those vital aspects of Huxley's youth. I shall then turn to his writings and trace in them not merely the arc of artistic achievement and decline, but also the progress of a dedicated generalist seeking to bring all knowledge, in so far as it lies within one man's compass, into a synthesis that will give total meaning to existence. In the earlier chapters of criticism, up to 1936, the expository works will tend to cluster round and illuminate the dominant novels. In the latter chapters, the situation will be reversed. If it is obvious that in the 20s, point-counterpoint was more important than do what you will, it is equally evident that in the 60s, Island derived its slight importance almost entirely from the fact that it brought into a convenient synthesis all the ideas on problems of human living and dying that have been scattered in a whole series of expository books, from Ends and Means in 1937 to Brave New World Revisited in 1958. Any book on an author whose influence one has felt strongly becomes inevitably something of a personal testament, though the criticism it contains may be all the sharper for having emerged from the undulations of passionate reaction. Having admitted to the alteration of admiration and rejection that shaped my view of Huxley in the 30s, I feel an obligation at least to sketch out the philosophic standpoint from which I now take my view of him. My acceptance of Alice in Gaza as his best novel will, I hope, have removed the suspicion of surviving artistic bias. I am still as strongly a pacifist, a social decentralist, and a political libertarian as I was in 1936, and as Huxley remained to the end of his days. I have never disputed his warnings of the science-bred perils that threaten mankind and the earth even more darkly today than when he was alive. Yet I am convinced that the views of art and the artist function with which Huxley developed after 1936 were not only false in themselves, but also unfortunate in their effect on his work. I am no longer, as I was in 1936, a militant agnostic who halted before atheism only because it seemed another dogmatic position. I believe now that God exists. The universe, in all its complexity and order, is not accidental. I have reached this conclusion not through any agonizing spiritual crisis, nor by any flash of revelation, but by rational inference, and mainly because, if I have found the acceptance of a shaping and inspiring intelligence difficult, I have found it impossible in any other terms to explain the patterns in which nature and existence arrange themselves. I recognize no personal God. I see no function in organized worship beyond the assertion of human fellowship. And if I recognize an efficacy in prayer, I cannot disassociate this from my recognition of the existence of telepathic communication, and I cannot see either as more than unexplained aspects of the phenomenal world. If I see no reason to deny the occurrence of what we call mystical experiences, or to doubt the sincerity of those who describe such experiences as best they can, I equally see no reason to believe that they are more than psychological episodes, or that the world they reveal is other than that of the human mind, which of course reflects, as all else does, the universal intelligence. Thus, there are many ways in which I disagree with Huxley's view of the religious life. Yet, I find his development of great psychological interest, and I admire, above all, the courage with which he embarked on a quest of dubious outcome that aroused first the mockery and afterwards no more than the grudging tolerance of the intellectual and literary world.